for the past, probably 10, 20 years, the state has really pushed high school as preparation for college. Well, we're getting students who are not prepared for college.
Mm-hmm.
And B, what about all those students who don't want to go to college, whose gifts take them in other directions? So the education isn't working for them either. I think part of our problems is trying to standardize education, bringing it down to the lowest common denominator, not challenging our students to think or to articulate ideas. It really stems from a lack of agreement about what is good and what is true.
Mm-hmm.
Renaissance education is really about the cultivation of virtue. Because if you're training people for community service or to be leaders of the community, you want them to be good people. Because if they don't have a moral compass and they're the ones making and enforcing laws, it's not going to go well. Mm-hmm. So medieval education, because it happens within a clerical institution, doesn't really focus on character formation. Well, what Rousseau said is that man is corrupted by society. So children, when they're born, are naturally good, and things are peachy until they get into society, and that's what causes the corruption. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Sounds familiar to modern ideas.
Yes, exactly. So that idea is threaded in ideas of modern education, but it's so far back that people don't realize it.
All right, we've got an update for you on Lit. We are very close to being able to launch, but we're currently working on a lot of infrastructure things on making sure that everything on the website is polished so that it's easy to use for you. So with that, we are very hopeful that we are going to launch next Monday, which is August 18th. However, we're going to be pushing that back probably about 3 weeks. We're aiming at September 8th. Part of that is we're traveling for 10 days in there for some recordings in Idaho. So we are going to be keeping you updated on that launch. We're aiming at September 8th, but we do want to keep you updated. We're very close. All the videos are finished. They're looking great, but we want to make sure that the user interface works very well for you. So feel free to reach out with any questions for the updates, but we'll keep you abreast of information as they keep coming in. Thank you. God bless.
Were you always classical education, or did something bring you to that?
Well, I'm a historian of education.
Okay.
So I think I've always been classical.
Mm-hmm.
And, I read history books for fun when I was a kid. And I took Latin in high school and absolutely loved it.
Mm-hmm. Was it the order of the language, or like that it's very logical and it makes sense like a puzzle?
Yes.
Okay.
I think that's the initial fascination. But then when you see it, in the hands of like a Cicero or Virgil or Livy, it's like, it's like the mother tongue. So, so that's kind of, and my special field is Reformation.
Mm-hmm.
So my dissertation was on higher education in late 16th century Germany. What I was looking at is a Catholic school and a Lutheran school. And what I wanted to know was the impact of the Reformation on the curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
And so as we're going back, with the rise of the Renaissance humanism, we're going back to a more classical ideal of education in the universities. So I knew a lot about it historically. So when we were asked to develop a classical education program,
here at MacWan at Concordia. Okay.
Yeah, Angus, his office is next to mine.
Mm-hmm.
So he asked me if I would collaborate in developing this program. So he kind of had we kind of have like a division of labor. He handles a lot of like the external synodical relations.
Mm-hmm.
He knows people within the synod. He knows people within the larger classical education world. And I handle more like the curriculum, arranging for student teaching, getting our teachers placed, which is not hard to do. So kind of, division of labor.
Yeah. Nice. Are we live, by the way, Bennett? We are live. Okay. Yeah. If you want to just tilt your mic in just slightly, kind of that angle. Yes. Okay. All right. And we are back, and we're with Dr. Susan Mobley. And you are a professor here since 1998, is that right?
That's
at Concordia, Wisconsin, which is where we're recording. So we've got one of our remote studios set up, and very interested in diving into this. We're at the CCLE conference, so Classical Christian Lutheran Educators Conference, and you're going to be presenting here.
Yep.
But excited that we get to sit down and kind of dive into this. So to kind of set the stage, if you can maybe just explain, and I'll set this up, but kind of explain the modern situation, because I think for a lot of listeners, they might not be plugged into like some of the deeper dialogues when it comes to how we educate students. But I think, almost everyone I talk to recognizes something's wrong, right? They're looking either at students that are graduating high school or college, and they're recognizing that something is a little bit off there. Maybe they're looking at, we were talking about like the anxious generation type things, or they're actually like looking at their schools, especially post 2020, when they were kind of forced to look at the curriculum, and they're saying, this is off and this is off, right? So everyone's kind of asking that question. And if you can just kind of paint like, what is it about today that we are seeing that people are kind of sensing is wrong?
Well, it's not doing what it's supposed to do. Not that we should rely too heavily on test scores, but they do give you sort of an indication of what students are learning or what they're not learning. So, we have multiple problems. One is just curricular. Students aren't learning. They don't know how to read. You can't. It's difficult to encourage them to read, but they're also not completing high school with life skills. And it depends on what state you're in. I think the problems are nationwide, but I think different states have different problems. So, for example, like here in Wisconsin, for the past probably 10, 20 years, the state has really pushed high school as preparation for college. So the idea is to prepare students for college. Well, we're getting students who are not prepared for college. And B, what about all those students who don't want to go to college, whose gifts take them in other directions? So the education isn't working for them either. I think part of our problems is trying to standardize education, bringing it down to the lowest common denominator, not challenging our students to think or to articulate ideas. And some of this, I think, is it really stems from a lack of agreement about what is good and what is true. So, and I know we're going to get into this later about postmodernism. Postmodernism is truth is relative, and, get into that, any lifestyle is okay because it's your choice. Well, if you don't give students a body of truth from which they can make judgments about what's good and what's bad, we're not preparing them for life.
What kind of, have you seen some concrete things as you watch students over the last 27-ish years? Like, have you seen some trends? Concordia has a subset of students. So we have a lot of Lutheran students. We have a lot of Catholic students. We have a lot of students from various Christian denominations. And the students who come here, even if they themselves don't come from a church background, I think they come to Concordia because that's either consciously or subconsciously they're seeking that kind of a setting. So I'm not sure that, for me, it would be difficult. Maybe I don't have like a good sample size to, like if you're at a state school, right? That just kind of gets the conglomerate of people in that region.
But but my sons went to a public high school, and the theory of modern education today is that it does not want to privilege any set of values. So it proffers to be values free. Well, once you say that actually is a value. So you have chosen that as a value. But if you are values free, that means you're free of values. What do you have left? So, we're definitely not encouraging students to develop the 4 cardinal virtues of justice, prudence, temperance, fortitude, because we don't know what good character is. If we can't agree on what good character is, then how can we promote it in students?
So it's like if we don't have an articulated aim that we're driving towards, then there's some kind of vacuum. And something takes its place, but it's going to be messy. It's not going to be cohesive. It's not going to be maybe thoroughly thought through. Right.
And, part of the problem is the state's responsibility. So, public education is the purview of the state. But the state's primary obligation is for the prosperity of the Commonwealth. So the state tends to think in economic terms. Producing people for the job market, producing people to fill slots in the economy. But then the sort of personal spiritual element gets lost in that. So I think that's kind of one of our problems with public education is when you take the values out, you're missing aspects of what makes us human.
I think we talked with Ryan McPherson about that, and he said something that's entirely true anecdotally speaking, right? And that if you talk with parents of students, and you start talking a little bit about education, very quickly it's, well, yeah, I want my child to be like an engineer, right? Or even if they're not prescribing a specific one, they have some kind of white collar job that pays well so that they can, buy a nice house and do nice things. And that's a very nice thing. We've got 4 young kids and we've got things that we want to do with our kids, and like that takes money. So that's part of the program, but it's not the only part of the program, right? But once that becomes like that, you don't necessarily need to be a just person in order to make a lot of money. So that becomes, at least by its very nature, it has to become secondary to the primary goals of what education is doing if they are feeding that desire.
Yes. Yeah. So I think the overemphasis on career preparation is without a corresponding balance, right? So, I mean, one thing, we are seeing a mental health crisis in this country, and I think we talked a little bit about the anxious generation, that a lot of these children, by the time we get them in college, they're very anxious, they're very stressed. I don't think that they have really learned anything of value, and they know it. Now, whether or not they know it consciously or unconsciously, I think they have a sense that there's something wrong. But, when they're 18, they don't have the frame of reference to know what that is that's missing, what that is that's wrong. So I think that's why actually we get a lot of those students at Concordia, because they're sort of unconsciously seeking that missing piece. Yeah.
I remember running into, more at SEM, right? I ran into some of my classmates who were properly educated, right? And I took a little bit of time, and then I recognized it. And the distinguishing factor, I mean, I can remember one individual, Daniel Broadus, who went to, I think, Patrick Henry College. And, he was so comfortable exploring ideas. And he trusted his mind, and he trusted just the ability. And it wasn't that he was always right or that he expected to always be right, but he was just comfortable thinking, right? So he wasn't anxious about expressing an idea or asking a question. He was just very comfortable exploring what is, what we might call true, good, and beautiful. And that was very different from some of my other experiences where we would be very quick to say like, well, I don't know about that area, right? And we would use that as kind of a deflector. But in other words, like we're anxious about speaking to that because what if we might be wrong?
Yeah. So, and this is something that I'm increasingly seeing in students. And part of it is their fixation on grades, right? So they, and I know my son was just telling me about this, his high school experience. He takes a history class, and they have a test, and he takes the test. He has to study, he takes the test, but he never needs that material again. They never do anything with it. So by the time I get the students, they're fixated on the assignment and the grade on the assignment. And what they don't understand is I am much more interested in the process by which they create that product than the actual product itself. So, this past semester I had probably an overwhelming majority of the class use AI to generate the paper. And so they're completely missing the point of the assignment. They're missing the point of education. The point of education is not to do seat time and get a piece of paper that says you have a degree. The point is to challenge yourself and to learn and to grow and to be able to think and to be able to speak and listen. That's another thing.
That is a valuable tool. Underrated tool.
Yes, very underrated.
So I've got some things I want to explore with you, but let's do that maybe towards the end, because this is something that I've been very interested in the past couple of years, and I've been learning and whatnot. So I sit and I think and come up with ideas and whatnot. But let's with that modern framework kind of in mind, and maybe we can keep kind of coming back to that. Let's jump into your area of expertise, which is 16th-century education, and I don't know if it was caught on camera. You were kind of explaining it, but there's kind of this Lutheran and Catholic split in religion at the form of the Reformation. So if you can kind of explain your area, and then let's learn about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, you have to think about it in these terms, so from the well, really from the conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity, there was one church. Well, okay, two churches if we count the Eastern
Those
Church.
other ones over
but
the
right
river.
there is, 1054 we got the irrevocable split with the Eastern Church. But in Europe at least we have one church, and it's a broad umbrella. It does allow for a range of theological opinion within that umbrella, but it's there are limits. If you cross the line, you're into heresy, and then there's discipline involved. But when we get to the Reformation, now we have more than one church. So we have options. So if you're Luther, your priority is to educate people properly in the Scripture. And it's not just I translate the Bible in German and I'm going to hand it to them and say read it. An unguided reading of Scripture is probably just as dangerous, maybe even more dangerous than not reading it at all. So we have to equip people to know how to read the Scriptures with understanding, and that's really what Lutheran education was designed to do, was to help people understand their faith, to be able to read the Scriptures daily for their edification. Heads of households for responsibility for educating their children. But this is the point in time when the state actually is going to assume responsibility for education. This is an era in which people believe if you don't have religious uniformity, you don't have political stability. So in the Holy Roman Empire, the German nation, which is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, but that's what we called Germany back in those days, you have over 300 principalities, and they're all doing their own thing. So the Catholics are united under the Catholic Church, and so there's going to be a reform of education. The Council of Trent is the big thing there, but the primary agents of Catholic education in the 16th century, the Jesuits. Ironically, by the end of the 16th century, Jesuit education and Lutheran education is in some ways very similar. Theology, obviously, very different, but they both emphasize the liberal arts. They both emphasize within that the studia humanitatis. Those are the verbal disciplines: grammar, logic, rhetoric, history, poetry. And what they are both concerned about is not only inculcating people in principles of the faith, and that's where the Catholics and Lutherans would differ, but they're also interested in helping people to live godly lives. And so for that, I think both Catholics and Lutherans believe there's a certain level of education for people was necessary. Now, the difference would be on the Lutheran side, there is a place for the laity within the expression of religion. So in worship services, for example, the laity have a participatory role. There's a part for them to play in the worship service. In the Catholic service, they're essentially the audience, the spectators for the worship service. So the education they need is different. So that's kind of what some of my research uncovered.
So if that's this, it seems like there's maybe two central. One is kind of biblical literacy, so you can get that right, and then the other is like virtuous living.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
So that structure that they're building, right, which I mean, to many degrees they inherited. They're not coming up with, as you mentioned, like the trivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric, history, poetry. Why do they see that as essential to forming those kind of characters, or a well-formed life might be a way of putting it?
And that's a really good question. I think at the time, and this starts with the Renaissance, the golden past of the Greeks and Romans was held up as the standard, right? And if you think about that, have you ever seen My Big Fat Greek Wedding? It all goes back to the Greeks. Well, to some degree, that's true. The Greeks did invent a lot of things, and their education really was designed to develop individual potential, so that individual citizens could participate fully in the polis, because the polis did not function without the full participation of its citizens. The Romans have a similar idea, but they're working with a much larger political entity than the polis. We have the republic, and then we have the empire. And what's important there is citizens are important. Citizens have a role in the political entity of the Roman state. But what's most important is the ability to speak. But speaking well isn't just, do I sound good? It's, do I know something? And can I express it in a persuasive way for a good end? So essentially, it's a wise man speaking well. It's sort of the Roman ideal. So those ideas were picked up again in the Renaissance. And this is a period of time when those Renaissance, there is no such thing as Italy. We have a collection of states. But basically what it is you have people once again governing themselves. There's no bishop, there's no lord, there's no king. It's the citizens of these cities governing themselves. So naturally, what model would they turn to? It's not the model of the Middle Ages, which is monarchy. It would be back to that classical past to the Greeks and Romans. So I think that's why we started with the emphasis on the liberal arts, the studia humanitatis as the appropriate form of education to form the individual for a life of faith. Mm-hmm. I think Melanchthon, though, went back to some of the ideas of the church fathers in the early medieval period. So the Greeks and the Romans are largely secular in orientation. They're pagan. Starting with the church fathers in the early medieval period, we're taking that same view of classical education, the liberal arts, but we're now putting it in service of the church. So, for example, what I like to call the Carolingian project, this is under Charlemagne. He was very much aware that classical past was slipping away. So what he was very intent on was preserving that classical heritage for his realm, but also in protecting the church and preserving the gospel, so that you can see that sort of that combination of the liberal arts as necessary for the preservation of the gospel during the time of Charlemagne. Mm-hmm. So most of the reformers and the humanists of the Renaissance thought that education took a detour in the late medieval period.
And that was like towards scholasticism?
Yeah.
Okay. Which was that a heavier focus on logic almost at the expense of grammar?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And in fact, grammar, so we're still talking Latin. Latin is the language of education. But we have to remember that by the time we get to the late medieval period, Latin is a second language for everybody. So a lot of boys are going to learn it fairly young, and if they enter a monastery when they're young, that's what they'll learn it. But grammar, by the time we got to the late medieval period, is used actually to teach logical principles. And we talked about, you asked me why I like Latin. Is it the logic? Is it because it's like a puzzle? Mm-hmm. And it's a perfect vehicle for teaching principles of logic. But it doesn't help you read Cicero and appreciate the beauty of Virgil's poetry, right? It just helps you with syllogisms or formal analysis. And that's what you need for disputation, which is the formal academic exercise within the medieval university. But it's within, it's an ivory tower kind of thing. So it's not the sort of education that prepares you to be a clerk or a bishop. But it forms the mind. So there is benefit to it. It does form the mind. It disciplines the mind. But by the time we get to the Renaissance, and we're looking for people who can be active in self-government, in furthering the prosperity of the community, that education was not seen as useful. And it really didn't have anything to do because, a lot of the universities, they're clerical institutions. So not only is the authority of the university to grant a degree stems from the authority of the Pope, who's a universal authority. I just lost my train of thought.
Well, I kind of had a thought I might build off this, and I might maybe put the light bulb on, but because it seems like, I've heard this pushback against, you're talking about, just historically speaking, classical education. This is the way education was done classically, and if you bring up something like the Trivium, where it's like grammar, which is kind of base information, logic, how you formulate that rhetoric, how you, articulate that, right? And it kind of flows through. One of the things that people often will say is like, well, I bet I can't disagree, especially if you show them some of the studies, like that sounds like it's a really good way to educate, but does everyone really need that, right? And it is almost that idea that this is like this is kind of like those people that are going to be big into philosophy, or those pastors that get like hyper interested in theology or something like that. But what you're saying is that it's actually kind of the opposite, that this structure that we returned to, right? It was there kind of before, and then it's come back in Renaissance, and you will see it in kind of Reformation history. It's really geared towards the person, not like the supreme person, but just the regular person, because it makes you free. It makes you able to think and articulate clearly. Yeah.
And that's where I lost my train of thought. So Renaissance education is really about the cultivation of virtue. Because if you're training people for community service or to be leaders of the community, you want them to be good people. Because if they don't have a moral compass and they're the ones making and enforcing laws, it's not going to go well. So medieval education, because it happens within a clerical institution, doesn't really focus on character formation, right? And because a lot of the students in medieval universities are actually coming from monastic orders, their ethos comes from those monastic orders, not from the universities. So there's a missing component. So this is something that the Renaissance humanists identified as a missing component of scholastic education. And the reformers also saw deficiencies in medieval education, not the exact ones that the Renaissance humanists saw, because the Renaissance humanists, they're not anti-Christian. Sometimes they get labeled that. They're focused on the secular. They're focused on daily life. They're focused on the community. Whereas the religious reformers like Luther and Melanchthon are concerned about that, but they're also concerned about people's faith. What do people understand about God's grace?
So what would be, let's kind of get specific here. So if I were I've got a kindergartner next year, Eiley, right? So if she were to live during this time period, let's say Melanchthon's got this kind of hashed out, right? And he's got his school, and I enroll Eiley as a kindergartner. What's going to be her experience to the end of her education? How's that going to, what is she going to experience, and why is that put in place?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that, because actually with the Lutheran Reformation, we see the beginnings, and it's going to take a couple centuries to fully form, but the beginnings of the German educational system. I don't know if you know anything about the German educational system. No. Yeah, there's two tracks. So you have elementary schools. And then the next level is where the students are sorted out. So you have them either go to the gymnasium, and that's essentially preparation for college. So students who go to gymnasium are going to go to university. Or you have them go to something called the Realschule. And those are preparing for vocations, technical vocations.
Carpenter.
Yeah. Okay. So in Germany, the same thing is true, because Latin is not everyone's spoken language. It's German, whatever dialect it happens to be, because the language of the university is still Latin. If you want to be a teacher or a doctor or a lawyer or a pastor, you have to go to university. That means you have to know Latin. So that educational track is going to start with what they call the trivial schools, because they teach the trivium. And what it's going to focus on is primarily Latin, teaching the kids to read, to write, to speak Latin. And then when they get to the what in the 16th century was called the pedagogium, that's the same thing as the gymnasium. You are going to enhance your study of Latin grammar, syntax by reading Terence, Virgil, Cicero, Ovid. But you're also going to add things like dialectic, rhetoric, mathematics, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy. And then those are the basic studies that you need to enter the arts faculty at the university. And that's where everyone starts. Everyone starts in the arts faculty.
What would the arts be?
The arts would be a continuation of those. So, it's actually, and that's what my paper is going to be about at the conference. Melanchthon reframes the liberal arts. So he's actually not talking about the 7 medieval liberal arts of the trivium, the quadrivium. He actually expands the number to 9. And really he's seeing it, melded with philosophy. So natural philosophy, moral philosophy, they all connect. So that's the principal education that a student would receive in the arts faculty. And then, some students did not complete a degree. Some students stopped with a baccalaureate degree. Some got the magister degree. Some went to higher studies in law, theology, or medicine. So that's one track. The other track is for those people who don't speak Latin, but German is their language. There are schools for them, so German schools. So here, German would be spoken. So you're not focusing on the medieval trivium and the quadrivium, but you're still teaching students how to read, how to write, how to speak German. You're teaching them how to count, how to calculate. You're teaching them skills that are necessary not only for a particular, in Luther's terms, vocation, like a job, like a career path, but you're also teaching them. So if you have a daughter, you're also teaching them to be good housewives, to be good mothers, to be good companions, to be good models for their community. So a lot of those, there are some necessary skills that would be developed, and not all of them are just doing skills. Some of them are thinking skills, right? If you're a mother, you wear many hats, and you have to know how to do many things, and problem solving is chief among them. So to do that, you have to know things. But there's also an emphasis on faith formation. So the catechism, for example, is one of the things that would be used in one of the German schools.
Yeah, I can see. Yeah, I mean, so that's home ec, right?
Yep.
That would be kind of like that modern home ec. And
Yep.
yeah, I can see the value. I'm just speaking to the second one. My wife and I were reflecting. Like, I don't think I ever had any actual formal training on how to be a husband or a father. I think I've heard some sermons, or perhaps it came up, in a Bible study, or something like that. And I think my parents, I was blessed with good parents. They led by example,
right?
But it was never like a formal teaching of like, it's just unnatural, like for us today. Like, I don't think my father like took me, and he's a great father and a great example of a husband, but, and said like, here's something I'm doing, and this is why we do this for our wife, and then like, but that doesn't really take place. Moms today are not like trained to be like, someday you're going to have a daughter, or you're going to have a son. So like, this is what you do. Here's how you change. This is what happens when baby's crying, and like to be trained for that, so that when they have their own kid, this is something that's second nature to them.
Yeah. And, it's so funny because I'm a historian, so I like old things. And so I have been, since modern TV is a vast, desolate landscape, I watch old TV shows. And there's the Donna Reed show. I don't know if you've ever watched that. It's a great show. It starts in 1959. I think it runs for like 8 seasons. But there's this one episode where there's this radio program coming to their community, and he wants to know about what it means to be a housewife. So he goes to the grocery store and he's interviewing women, and it's always this, well, I'm just a housewife. And so Donna Reed takes exception to that. She's like, I'm not just a housewife. And then the whole episode walks through what it is a wife and mother has to do. And it's, you have to be a philosopher and a doctor and a psychologist and an artist and a craftsperson and a fixer. And there's so many things that you have to know how to do to be a housewife. And I think sometimes that we don't value that in education.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of practical applications for parents in education. We could do a better job at making that connection for young people.
Yes, I would love to offer that to my children. Because in many ways we have a generation of parents who are this is not it's very second nature, for us. So let's compare. So if you were to compare kind of what's being formulated here, and then compare that to the modern day education system, what are going to be some similarities and what are going to be some differences? And then maybe we can kind of lean into what are the results from these differences in education?
Well, as I said before, the emphasis is on career preparation. It is not really on the cultivation of the individual and the whole person. And, there have been a lot of studies. Alan Bloom wrote a book in, I think, 1987 on the closing of the American mind. And, what he talked about is, in the classical idea, the individual, and this idea is going to carry all the way through the Enlightenment. And in the modern era, we're going to see challenges to it. But there was always an understanding that an individual was comprised of a physical and a spiritual. Right? That inherent in every human was a transcendent part, which is most often called the soul. Right? Well, what Bloom says is that in the modern era, we have conflated that with the psyche, with the self. So we've kind of lost that idea that there's a component of humanity that's transcendental. It's not, it's immortal. It's not mortal. And so you're basically truncating humans. You're shutting off an entire aspect of what it means to be human. And the reason, of course, is that values-free education. Well, if we accept that there's this transcendental part, well, that gets us into religion, and we just can't have that, right? So I think that's part of the issue. Some of the other things is, as I mentioned before, if we can't agree on what's good, then how can we inculcate character in students? within the American system, this has always been a problem, right? If we have a document that says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, well, that would mean that education is open to all, and all should have education.
Mm-hmm.
But we have, I think, have made a false equation between equal and same. Right?
Yeah.
Because not all students are different. Every classroom is different. Every collection of students is different. Every school is different. Every teacher is different. So how do we standardize something that is so varied?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's kind of another one of our problems. We're trying to standardize things because we're so concerned about discriminating and leaving people out that we water things down. We take out the substance because, heaven forbid that we offend somebody. And so that students aren't asked to wrestle with some of these ideas, some of these disagreements. I don't think they have learned to agree respectfully.
Mm-hmm.
They haven't learned to disagree respectfully. So I think those are some of the differences that I would see.
Yeah. Let's kind of track. So if we kind of go back to, is there anything else you want to say about what we're seeing in kind of the 16th century and, particularly kind of what's coming in the Lutheran tradition as far as education? Because then we'll move on to, and we can jump towards like the Enlightenment period. And there's a couple other things that we're going to highlight where changes start to be brought into that system. Is there anything else that we need to know about that 16th century education before that?
No, I think we'll probably come back to that as we trot through.
Okay. Do you want to jump to the Enlightenment?
Yeah, we could talk about the Enlightenment.
Okay. So what goes on during the Enlightenment? Maybe just even a brief description of what the Enlightenment is, and then how that affects education as it's kind of molding and evolving.
So the Enlightenment is to some degree a reaction to the religious dissensions of the 16th and 17th centuries. So the Enlightenment thinkers want, it originates as a French thing. I tell my students it's a French phenomenon because it develops in a context in France that's really different from everywhere else. So, for example, in France at the time of the Enlightenment, it's still feudal. So society is organized into three classes. You have your clergy, your nobility, and your everybody else category. You have a monarch who is essentially in charge of everything. You have something called the Estates General, which is a representative body that has representatives from those three estates that I just mentioned, but each one gets one vote. Who do you think always gets outvoted? It's the everybody else category, right? So they are the majority of the population, but they have the least amount of property, and yet they're paying the most amount of taxes. So we have a lot of problems in France. And so the philosophes, those are our Enlightenment thinkers, they think that part of the problem is that France is mired in tradition, and that tradition is a close collaboration between the king and church. And so that people are not free to make their own decisions or to develop powers of reason, thinking, learning, expressing. And so the Enlightenment is going to be that movement where we start focusing on the individual. But we are really trying to take established religion out, trying to take it out of the picture. So there's a couple of things that I can mention. So one is Rousseau, and I like to bash Rousseau. He said, let me just read you a couple of statements from Rousseau. I have my students read this in class. So here's one of the things he says. Everything is good as it comes from the hands of the maker of the world, but degenerates once it gets into the hands of men. Okay, what's he saying there?
So everything is good as it comes to God, but then once it reaches. So, I mean, if I'm looking at it from like a Christian perspective and from the church, whatever's happening in the church is not going to be an accurate representation of God's word, right? So it is kind of questioning that authority of God's word being transmitted through the church and through the scripture. Yeah.
And then he says, let us lay it down as an incontestable principle that the first impulses of nature are always right. There is no original perversity in the human heart.
Original sin is out.
Original sin's out. So what he's saying there is everything is good as it comes from the hands of the maker. So mankind is naturally good. Okay, what happened? What goes wrong? Degenerates once it gets into the hands of men. Okay, wait a minute. You just said that man is naturally good, but everything degenerates once it gets into men's hands. How do we reconcile those two statements? Well, what Rousseau said is that man is corrupted by society. So, so children, when they're born, are naturally good, and things are peachy until they get into society, and that's what causes the corruption. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sounds familiar to modern ideas.
Yes, exactly. So that idea is threaded in ideas of modern education, but it's so far back that people don't realize it.
Wow. Yes.
So he says then that reason, so that's what education is designed to do. It's designed to sort of preserve that inherent goodness of the individual into society. And if we can do that, then we can improve society. So Edward Gibbon, who I like to call the poster child for the Enlightenment thinking, he wrote a book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which is a very cheerful topic. But he said that we should acquiesce in the pleasing conclusion that every age improves the knowledge and perhaps the virtue of the human race. Okay, what's he saying?
Yeah, well, there's an idea of evolution. Like we are going to be better than those that were 300 years ago, right? We are on a trajectory that is improving and is upward oriented.
And so we're headed toward perfection, right? Now, if you think that, so think of the implications for religion. So if past eras are degenerate and they're not as advanced as we are, we're better, smarter, we're so much superior. Why do we look to the past for our answers? Okay, why is that a problem for Christianity?
Well, you can see it play out today, right? I mean, there's ideas that are being put forward in the church, particularly in America or Northern Europe, right? Some of these same ideas come up. And then the contestment is, well, like that's not in Paul or that's not in the scriptures. And certainly the early church didn't think this way. And for us, the way my mind works, it's like, that's got to be a closed case, right? Like we've never done this practice in the church. What makes us think we know better? But the way you're articulating is I'm actually feeding right into, if I say that, their thesis. They're saying, yes, well, of course, because we do know better than Augustine, I mean, our technology is so much better than the people before us. So naturally, we have way more figured out. So that's kind of so that's that Enlightenment idea of progress. So that over time, mankind improves. And then eventually, why do we need Jesus? Right? If there is no original sin and we're on the road to perfection anyway, and Jesus was, just that guy who wore dusty sandals and hung out with fishermen and sinners and way back centuries and centuries and centuries ago. He can't possibly have anything to do with us today, right? So he was kind of a stepping stone.
Yeah.
Like he might have served his purpose at that time. So you can kind of, you could even try to speak nicely of him. Like, yes, he was great. He was a prophet, right? He was a prophet of his time. And then we had more prophets of our time. But here we are today. So we can take a couple of his things, great. But like in the end, to your point, this is a man that lived 2,000 years ago.
Right. So that's kind of where it started. So, the Enlightenment does pick up on some of the things that they were talking about in the Renaissance, but the Renaissance really is operating in a Christian context, whether or not the Renaissance thinkers talked about it a lot, at least in the works that a lot of people read. But most of them, I think, were devout Christians. They just didn't spend a lot of time talking about theology.
Yeah.
But the Enlightenment does something very different. So whereas the Renaissance was a movement that looked to the past for inspiration and guidance. If you think about even the title of Gibbon's book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, his argument is, and in fact, he says later in the book, rather than wonder that the Roman Empire fell, we should rather wonder that it subsisted for so long. Right? So in other words, with the Enlightenment, we're no longer looking at the past as inspiration and a guide for us. We're oriented forward to the future.
Yeah. So that makes sense because you can see it coming. Just to kind of recap, as I'm kind of processing what you said. So you've got this idea that what's wrong is that people are being kept down because there are these institutions And these institutions are kind of wielding ideas of the past in order to oppress. So they indoctrinate and oppress.
Yes.
And then the key, to kind of put their rose-colored glasses on, of course, when they're saying these things, they think they're saying good things. They're not like scheming for the sake of evil in their own minds.
Absolutely.
So they're saying in order to lift them up, we need to stop that indoctrination. And what we need to do is kind of I forget who's the tabula rasa, the blank slate, right? But there's this idea that we need to eventually we need to start fresh, right? So there's no indoctrination of anyone that's gone before us. And then this brings about this kind of, in their mind, an enlightenment. The light is going to be turned on in the eyes of all these people, and we're just going to maybe focus on, this might be jumping ahead, but just kind of what can we observe and what can we prove?
Yes. And so it's all about, it really is a pursuit of truth. And they feel like some of these, like traditional religion institutions have really shrouded truth, and it's prevented people from that pursuit of truth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So can we go to, I know you mentioned a couple other people here, because I'm interested. Like Karl Marx is the one that I'm thinking of, but I know you have a couple other people that are down on different ways that this kind of starts to form, right? Because this starts here in France.
Yeah.
And then where does it go from there?
It spreads all through Europe, but it takes different forms in different countries, because different countries of Europe don't have the same problems that France does.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, in England, and England is important for the American context because the origins of this country come out of England. England had its revolution in the 17th century. France, the United States, had theirs in the 18th century. And as I tell my students, it's important to remember the American Revolution came before the French Revolution. So the American Revolution is very much inspired by the revolution of the late 17th century. And that's where Locke comes in, because Locke, among other things, basically wrote a justification for they basically switched monarchs. So the latter part of the 17th century, the English thought that their sovereign was going to turn the country Catholic. There were some other things that he was doing, but it really was religiously motivated for many of them. And so Locke is justifying the English overthrowing that king and putting another monarch on the throne. So if you read the revolutionary document, it's called the Declaration of Right from 1689, right at the top of the list, it says that the reason for the revolution was because the monarch was trying to extirpate the Protestant religion. And so then what we get then is an enumeration of the rights that the monarch is supposed to secure. So that's the idea of Locke, right? This political contract. And the purpose of government is to secure the rights that are inherent in man from the Creator.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Right? So the Enlightenment context is a little bit different. So, as you know, sometimes with my students, we'll look at that Declaration of Right from 1689, and we'll look at the French Declaration. The French have to start by explaining to the French people what their rights are. If you look at the statement of the American Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Right? That there's already an understanding in those people that there are some inherent rights given to them by God, and it's the purpose of God. It's the purpose of government to secure those rights.
And that's coming out of the England.
That's coming out of coming out of the English tradition. So what happens in the American Revolution is different than what happens in the French Revolution. Now, that does not mean that the American Revolution is not influenced by ideas of the Enlightenment. A lot of them were very influenced by Enlightenment thinking, but I think it was sort of anchored by some very strong religious sentiment. So that's why I think that the American trajectory and the European trajectory after the Enlightenment is a little bit different.
Okay.
Yeah. So one of the things that happens then after the Enlightenment, because, you know, the Enlightenment is all about reason. And this is the time when we're starting to see the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. So we're on the path toward the development of what we're going to think about as modern science. So there is a movement called Romanticism. And what Romantics, they're critics of the age of reason, because they say that this overemphasis on reason is ignoring other aspects of humanity, emotions, the ability to appreciate beauty, goodness, right? These are all sort of intangibles that you can't grasp from reason. So they're trying to put some of those affective elements back in to reason.
What is the time period of the Romantic movement?
It's the 19th century, and it goes through different phases. But one of the things that I like to talk about is Mary Shelley's novel, Frankenstein. It was written in 1818. So the Industrial Revolution is underway in England at this particular point in time. And what Mary Shelley she's doing, there's so many themes. And then she was 18 when she wrote that.
Was she really?
She was 18.
Bennett, we've missed our day.
That's what I tell my students. Clock is ticking. So there's so many themes that you can pull out of Mary Shelley's novel. But I think what she's trying to get people to do, and maybe she's asking herself to do the same thing, is to sort of contemplate the limits of human reason. Mm-hmm. The aspects, so emotions are part of the human experience. But if you have emotions without reason, it ends badly. Mm-hmm. But she's also very concerned about the use of reason in scientific terms. Mm. So the premise of the novel is there's a man named Victor Frankenstein who has at his life's project to conquer the barrier between life and death. He wants to create life. And so this is in sense what he does. He creates in the novel, it's called The Creature. He always calls it the monster. But it's based upon a vision. This whole novel is based upon a vision that Mary Shelley had. It was like a nightmare. And I just want to read her initial vision, because I think it spells out the themes of that novel and how it plays into this idea of progress. She said, "I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then on the working of some powerful engine show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. Frightful must it be, for supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavor to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world." Mm. So that's getting at that, that what are the limits of human reason? And can we press and take it too far? Can we do something that we shouldn't? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of really what she's exploring in the whole novel. And it really is focused on this idea, sort of, I think, of technology and science, mm-hmm. And exploring that question, just because we can do something, should we? Mm-hmm. Which, once again, is missing those fundamental questions that you're getting back with education, of like the formation of character and this unification around, here's the aim of something. And if you're unified around those kind of moral objectives, then you can answer those why questions. Or should I do this or should I not do this? Right? But you kind of miss that when everything is just built on reason for the art of evolution, or for the art of the next step or progress. Yeah. And so, I think this is one of the problems that scientists are faced today. They I don't think they've ever been asked to think about that question. Mm-hmm. Should I do this? That you start to see the beginnings of that. I don't know. I know a lot of people watched this movie Oppenheimer. Yes, I did watch that. Right. And so that's the same thing. I have to watch. Yeah. And that's the same question that those scientists have to grapple with, mm-hmm. but after the atomic bomb. Mm-hmm. Right. Which is a product of, I mean, now that you say that, that's a really good picture of the product of our education system, because that question, you can't actually silence that voice, right? Like at some point you do ask those theological questions, right? Of should I do this? Should I, that you can't silence that voice because the law is written on our hearts, but you can train people in such a way that that's not on the forefront of their mind. The conscience catches up with them after the fact. Right. And, that's one of the problems with human conscience is, and we've kind of made a distinction between, well, if we pass a law and the law says it's legal, well, then I can go ahead and do this. But it may be something that's not good for you. And it may be something that inherently is wrong. And because you inherently know it's wrong, your conscience tells you that. Mm-hmm. And then guilt eats away at you. Right. Mm-hmm. So just because we've called something legal doesn't mean it's inherently right. Yeah. Yeah. We were talking with Louis Marcos about, I can't remember. It's all these Greek names. Right, everything's Greek, but it was one of their myths that they had
and it was what was it? Two brothers, or three brothers. Two of them are fighting, and they cause like a war or something like that. So then the other brother ends up becoming king, and brothers kill each other. They're fighting for kingship. So the third brother ends up becoming king, and then he has to decide what to do with the body. So what he does, because he's worried about civil justice and things kind of playing out well, is he can't call them both heroes because then they're going to keep fighting. So he says, do you know the story?
Yep, it's
okay.
Antigone. It's Sophocles.
If you want to fill
Antigone.
it in, you're going to explain it better than I will.
Yeah, no, and that's the problem. So that whole play is a conflict. So you have Antigone. It's actually a great play. We read that in our Western culture class, because you have two characters. So it's actually a double tragedy. Mm-hmm. So you have Antigone, and she, for love of her brother, and what she says is the law of the gods requires that my brother be buried, even if he were a rebel. Mm-hmm. My love for him and divine law tells me that I must bury him. But just as you were saying, Creon is like, if I bury this guy, he was a rebel, he tried to overthrow the state, that's just going to encourage other people to rise up and cause another war and more chaos. So my job is to maintain civil order. Mm-hmm. So there's that great conflict then in Greek thought. They acknowledge there's a difference sometimes between divine or universal principles and what we think of as civil or customary law. So, it's a double tragedy because at the end, Antigone kills herself, as happens in most Greek plays. And Creon, because of his failure to listen to advice, it results in the death of his son and his wife. Mm-hmm. So he's left with the pile of dead bodies, knowing that he was ultimately responsible. Mm.
Man, they were good at writing.
Yeah, no, yeah.
But which is an extension of that. They're wrestling with these
Correct.
things, right? Which is something worth recovering.
Yes.
Where we think through the depth of the effects and the ripple effect of the decisions we make, both individually, but then also as communities and such.
Yeah, and so what's interesting about that play is the closing lines of the chorus are basically urging the audience to think about that the aim of life is a balance. Mm. It's a balance between those two things. It's a balance between religion and reason, right? Mm-hmm. We would think of it in terms of faith and reason.
Yeah.
If you go too far in one direction, not only do you as an individual lose the balance, but it has consequences for everyone around you.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back to that thread. And let me just take a stab at seeing if I'm kind of internaling this, and I'm trying to kind of connect some of the things with the thread. So I'm kind of, as you were talking, I was kind of interested in, so you've got scholasticism, which is a kind of a hyper focus maybe on the logic aspect, and you're maybe losing the grammar, which in the biblical sense, it means like maybe we're not as focused on the scriptures, but we are very focused on kind of cultivating the systematics or the ideas and the formulas that come through, but we're not focusing so much on the raw data, and maybe we're not worried so much on the way that forms an individual or even the rhetoric aspect, because it's mostly kind of, an ivory tower or university type monastic type setting. So that's there. Then in the Renaissance and through the Reformation, there's kind of this, you're bringing it back to the whole human character, right? So there's that aspect with a big focus on the rhetoric and of course a big focus on, diving into the scriptures and the languages and such. So you've got that. Then at least in France and stuff, right? I mean, some of these nations.
Just say West. In the West.
In the West. Then we start to be suspect of the church.
Yes.
And when you become suspect of the church, we haven't necessarily lost an idea that there is a divine and there is a creator, but we suspect the ways that we have all agreed upon for a long period of time that he communicates with us.
Yes.
So we're kind of pulling that away for the reasons we've already articulated. And now we're kind of back to, we're almost back to that scholastic type where we're just going to focus on logic and our own observation. And then this gives birth to a kind of a hyper focus on science.
Yep.
And maybe even more so the scientific method, which is kind of an extension of what can I rationally, just through my observation, how can I test that and make sure that we're kind of, that we're succeeding logically, I guess you could say. And it ends up just becoming mostly in kind of the creation of things. But we've kind of lost these more ethereal type, the morality and the theology of things. Is there a way that we've returned to scholasticism without Christianity attached to it.
Yeah, I think it's definitely an overemphasis on reason.
Okay.
And
you can critique anything that I'm saying. I'm like a student here, so you can yeah, I don't know about that. So
yeah, it's not, where scholasticism really was about the pursuit of truth, but the guiding premise was that the scriptures were true. Mm-hmm. Therefore, they didn't have to waste any time arguing about whether or not the scriptures were true, because that was the premise. Mm-hmm. So they were arguing about other points, and this is why they sometimes ended up with really esoteric points, because
how many angels on
they can dance on the head of a pin, or whatever. So the pursuit of truth was understanding the deeper causes of things. But again, they're operating from that starting premise that everything that is in the scriptures is true. Okay. Now, of course, in the Middle Ages, we have, you can read scriptures on multiple levels.
Yes. Yeah.
And in the Reformation, Luther thought that was too complicated, and we have a simplified way to approach scripture. But yeah, in the modern era, and I think it does start with the Enlightenment, because it's not necessarily religion that the philosophes are rejecting. It's initially really the established church, and it's exactly how you framed it. That we have these people who are in positions of power and authority that are using those positions of power and authority to oppress people. And so that it causes a reaction. I think that once you begin to dissociate the exercise of human reason with eternal principles, you lose that sort of the sense that that God is more than just. So the Enlightenment, a lot of the philosophes were atheists, but a lot of them believed in God as creator. Mm-hmm. But as you put your finger on, they stopped believing that God continued to work in the world. So they didn't believe in revelation. So if God is no longer speaking to you, then you're on your own. Mm-hmm. And so then you exercise human reason, and then once you take a step on that path, you get further and further away. You get further and further away from God. Yeah, yeah.
So as we're kind of moving through the Enlightenment, what other characters do we need to be aware of as we're kind of watching? We're really kind of highlighting the shifts in thought, but of course this is going to mirror then the way this is expressed in education.
Well, I
with
think
Karl Marx.
I think the next big I don't know what you want to call them, detours, missteps, would be the 19th century, and every era is full of cross currents. Mm-hmm. So you have things that are seeming opposites, happening at the same time. But in retrospect, I think that we can see two thinkers of the 19th century that have had an inordinate impact upon the way the modern culture thinks about things. One of those would be Marx. Another would be Charles Darwin. So Marx, he does something that nobody had done before. He was looking at history in economic terms. And I know that Dr. McPherson talked about this in his podcast, that that history is a record of class conflict between the haves and the have-nots. But the thing about Marx is why we still read him is that his critique of capitalism hurts. Mm-hmm. Much like of what he yes. I mean, he hits him where it hurts, right? And I think that's the value of Marx, is that his critique of capitalism really should make us stop and think, wait, is he right about that? Has capitalism reduced all human relationships to a simple cash transaction? But Marx is trying to fix society in purely economic terms. So he thinks if he can remove classes, it will remove inequalities, economic inequalities between people, and then we can have a peaceful, orderly society. Mm-hmm. So his solution to the problem is wacky.
But he identifies the problem.
He identifies, he's not completely right. But
maybe not the problem, but he identifies
But he certainly identifies some of the problems, the perils and pitfalls of capitalism, even as it's developing. In 1848, when he wrote the Communist Manifesto, we hadn't fully shifted to a capitalist economy. So, but, he does not take account of human nature. So, we talked about Rousseau doesn't believe that humans are inherently bad. He thinks they're naturally good. So does Marx. So he thinks that the problem is that people just have unequal stuff. And if we can just remove the unequal stuff, we'll make everybody equal. What he's really looking for is everyone to be the same, right? But in order to make this happen, the proletariat, the workers, are going to have to rise up and overthrow the ruling classes.
Is it the bourgeois for him? Or that's
the bourgeoisie.
The French, right?
Now, the bourgeoisie have, in translations, that's the term that they use, is the bourgeoisie, because it captures a particular, those are your entrepreneurs. Those are your middle class, your entrepreneurs. Those are the ones who shoved out the feudal nobility. But the problem, of course, is once you overthrow the government and you want to redistribute property, well, somebody has to do the redistributing. Who's that going to be? Well, Marx says, well, there'll be a group of communists, and once they redistribute the property and everyone is equal, then they will relinquish control and it'll all be fine. Well,
because you deny original sin.
And
so much goes back to that. I'm amazed that is a very important doctrine.
Yeah, it is, because it explains so much.
What is Chesterton has that great quote where he says something about, Bennett, can you look it up? It's the quote about skinning a cat. Look up Chesterton quote on skinning a cat. If Bennett did good editing skills, then you did not sit through that search engine fiasco. Okay, so this is beautiful, right? He says, if it be true, as it certainly is, that a man can feel exquisite happiness in skinning a cat, right, observationally, then the religious philosopher can only draw one of two deductions. He must either deny the existence of God, as all atheists do, or he must deny the present union between God and man, as all Christians do. He's speaking about original sin. He said, the new theologians seem to think it a highly rationalistic solution to deny the cat. Right. In other words, they're denying original sin.
And by focusing on something else, Cicero in his De Officiis is talking about the story of the guy just in the ring, which is a very old story. It comes way back in Greek, but it's the premise for Tolkien's ring story, right?
Yeah,
this idea that so the premise is that there is this ring that's found by a shepherd, and when you put it on, it makes you invisible. And he uses that ring to kill the king, who actually happens to be his boss, and to become king, and then to get rid of everybody who stands in his way or challenges him. And so the question that engages philosophers is, if you had the power of the ring and you could do something and not get caught, would you do it? And so what Cicero says is all the philosophers want to focus on, well, that's not possible. And that's impossible. There's no ring that can, rather than address the issue that the question is raising, they want to focus on the cat.
I've heard a good argument, and I'm really enticed by it, but that when Jesus says, you've heard it said, do not commit adultery, but I tell you, any man that looks lustfully, which is actually, he's using the Old Testament word for coveting there. So if you use the Septuagint, I believe it's the word for the 9th, 10th commandment, then he has also committed adultery. And really the point there that I think he's getting at isn't so much just a reminder that, like, you're walking down the street and someone walks by who's wearing a low cut, whatever, and you glance over, it's like, you've committed adultery. Like, no. The idea is the kind of the philosophical idea behind coveting is, if you had the ring and you could get away with it, would you do it? Right. And that's the point, is if you were allowed to do it and get away with it, would you do it? And if that's the case, you're not guiltless just because circumstances have made it such that you can't do that thing. Right. You look at the billionaires that have, committed sexual sins, and we love to kind of rake them on social media and, well, what a degenerate, It's like, okay. And you probably have never had the kind of, opportunities that person had. Does that actually make you superior?
Correct.
We don't know because you haven't been tested.
Right. Right. Yeah. So it's in that, that sort of question comes up over and over again. And again, it's inherent in that question of technology, right? Just because we can do something, should we?
Yes.
I mean, is it actually progress to do something that's detrimental just because it's science?
Yeah. Well, I've taken us on kind of an aside there, right? But the denial of original sin. So Marx is thinking, if you were to have this upheaval and you were to then put these people that would distribute all the property, make everyone happy, then they would relinquish power because they don't have original sin.
Right. And of course, it doesn't work. I mean, the Soviets tried that and it didn't go well.
20th century is a good case study of this, right?
Exactly. And I always have to remind my students, Marx is German. He's really talking about what's going on in Germany. The Russians are something completely different, but that's another story. So then the other 19th century thinker that I think had just a tremendous impact, maybe less so at his particular historical moment and more kind of cumulative, is Darwin. And everyone is familiar, I think, with Darwin's theory of evolution, but there's something he says in The Descent of Man. So he wrote 2 books, Origin of the Species and Descent of Man. And in this, what he's talking about, so first of all, he denies that man is created. Mm-hmm. So not only do we not have original sin, we now don't even have a creator. Mm. So man is formed somehow, right? So that all life on earth is originates from the same source. But and then through the process of natural selection, then what we see is biological evolution. But what he says in A Descent of Man is, along with that biological evolution, it has an impact upon man's facility of reasoning. So basically, as man improves biologically, he becomes more knowledge, right? So better brains equals more knowledge. But he equates that with moral goodness. So he says knowledge is good. So he makes the assumption that if people have more knowledge, they will do the right thing. And this will, of course, then lead not only to the development of individual moral character, but also, collective, societal improvement. Yeah. So he's equating, again, biological evolution with moral progress. Mm-hmm. So once again, we see that conflation of historical process being conflated with historical progress. Mm-hmm. So as science improves, man gets better. Mm-hmm. So that's an idea that I think is very prevalent in modernist thinking. I put Darwin under a label I call modernist, and the reason that I separate them out is because there are certain aspects of the modernist thought that seem reasonable, right? And it really is the problem I see with modernism is it assaults the church from the inside. Mm-hmm. Because it's like a slippery slope, right? Once you take, that sounds, that's of course, there is change over time, and, we have better toys, and we're more comfortable. So there must be something to this idea of progress. Well, once you start down that path, then it can affect the way, for example, the way you read scripture. So higher criticism, for example, is a movement in the late 19th century coming out of Germany, where they're applying reason and scientific method to the interpretation of scripture. And that's not, of course, what scripture is designed for, right? So so modernism to me is very pernicious, because it is an attack from within, because it's very easy for Christians to pick up some of these ideas very unwittingly and then apply them to theology.
I think that's been one of the most enlightening, I guess, intellectual things that I've realized maybe over the last 5 to 6 years or so. And it's just that, well, I'll put it this, Louis Marcos, we had on him, put it this way, he was dialoguing with a pastor who was very much against reading Greek stories and any of this kind of stuff, right? And he was very much on reading the Bible, and the way he read the Bible would not be like typological or whatnot. It was very kind of cut and dry, systematic Puritan type of expression, right? And when they were dialoguing, he said, "Well, this is what I advocate for because I'm a Christian." And Louis Marcos was like, "No, this is what you advocate for because you are a modern." And in other words, there are so many things that we as Christians will kind of do or think, or even ways that we interpret reality around us and Scripture that we think is, well, it's just because we're a Christian, but really it's it's the air we breathe from the world around us that has become modern, and it has in fact seeped into the church. And so we can see things and be like, well, I'm like, this is Christian. It's like, no, modernism does creep in, and it's very difficult to break out of that because that's the culture that we breathe, even though postmodernism is playing a role as well now too. But it is always good to just be aware, which is why studying history and such is so valuable, is because we are always going to be naive to the trends of the time.
Correct.
And that is always going to impact our interpretive lens.
And that, by the way, is why, starting with the Renaissance all the way up to the current day, we need to study history, because it helps us discern what is a current fad, what is an eternal, unchanging truth, right? And if you lose the sense of the past, because some of these debates are not new. I mean, the names are changed. Maybe we use different terminology, but it really is the same debate. And if we can become aware of that, we can be better equipped either to engage in the debate or to know how to respond to it.
So as this moves then to the educational system, then how does, because I've heard it said ideas start at the university, then they move to the teacher college, and then their conversations at Starbucks, right? And so the way that it becomes these ideas that some of these, ivory tower type thinkers are, debating on and writing on and whatnot, it does take a while before it seeps in, but it has to go through the education system. So maybe John Dewey's a good data point, but how does this then impact the way we do education in the West, or particularly America?
Well, I think, and again, that book by Alan Bloom, I think he pointed out, a lot of good things. He pointed out, for example, our problem with openness. Openness now has become a virtue, right? And what that means is you tolerate everything because if there is no absolute truth, everything is relative, then his opinion is just as valid as my opinion. And so openness becomes a virtue. But there are things that are wrong. There are things that are inherently bad. There are things that are destructive to humanity. So I think that's my problem with some of the virtue signaling that I see. I see it out of academics. And I see it, that again, as you said, it sort of kind of seeps down. So whenever I see one of those little, hate has no home here kind of signs, I think virtue signaling, and I'm like, well, what virtue actually are they signaling? Is it prudence? Is it fortitude? Is it justice? Is it right? It's openness. That's the virtue that they're signaling by being open to everybody's lifestyle, everybody's truth.
So that's something that seeps in. What is John Dewey's role in this? Or was there, I'm trying to remember, if I remember when we were talking on the phone, was there another kind of step here that you really wanted to articulate?
John Dewey is important for our modern educational system. And there's a couple of things I could say with John Dewey, but,
maybe explain who John Dewey is.
Yeah. So John Dewey was it's kind of, I guess philosopher is the best category to put him into, but he did a lot of work with education. He works out of the University of Chicago, early 20th century, and he was very concerned about the condition of American democracy and American education. And he is at that moment when we see the birth of the social sciences. So we talked about the rise of modern science in the 19th century and how science and technology claimed that ultimately it would solve all of our problems. Well, social scientists believed that they could apply the scientific method to humans. And we could diagnose social ills and then solve them through techniques of social science. Once again, what piece are we missing? That original sin piece.
Yes, yeah.
Right? That some of these social ills have to do with original sin, the sinfulness of man, not because of any social construct. Or the reason we have the social construct is because of original sin. But John Dewey wanted... So he's coming, you can trace a straight line from the Enlightenment. He wants to get rid of religion. He wants to create a religion that is centered on nature, on human relationships. He thinks that the Christian religion, and he talks about Catholics and he talks about Protestants, has impeded the development of social intelligence. So it's basically, it's holding humanity back. And we Americans could create a better society if we could abandon these religious principles and talk about these principles of nature, and I think democracy. Dewey is like Marx in the sense that much of his criticism, his critique of the current school system was spot on. There was a lot of things happening in schools that wasn't productive. It wasn't helpful for students. And so he wants to reform education. But like Marx, I think his solution to the problem isn't an improvement. In some ways, it makes it work. So, Dewey is in the beginning of social scientists when they believe in behavioralism, right? Okay. The ability to impact human behavior through training or through scientific social science principles. So for Dewey, where you can see his impact, I think, is in the development of social studies.
Ah, yes. Please speak to social studies.
So social studies was developed in the early part of the 19th century, and we tend to think of it in terms of history, but it's actually the driving force in the development of social studies were sociologists. Mm-hmm. So there's social science. So once again, so I don't be accused of misquoting anybody, let me read you a definition of social studies coming from the National Council for Social Studies, founded in 1922. Here's what it says. Social studies is the integrated study of the social sciences and humanities to promote civic competence. Within the school program, social studies provides coordinated, systematic study drawing upon such disciplines as anthropology, archaeology, economics, geography, history, law, philosophy, political science, psychology, religion, and sociology, as well as appropriate content from the humanities, mathematics, and natural sciences. The primary purpose of social studies is to help young people develop the ability to make informed and reasoned decisions for the public good as citizens of a culturally diverse, democratic society in an interdependent world. Okay, so what do you think about that?
That reminds me a little bit of the abolition of man, right? Which I would like to hear some of your thoughts there on, right? But it is kind of this, it's this, I mean, in some ways it's standing in the, not in the dock, but the opposite, right? Where you're kind of standing over and you're kind of being able to judge all of these different cultures. Is that correct?
Yep.
Yes. Rather than letting them kind of judge you.
Yeah. And it's, so if you think about the definition of social studies, I mean, what isn't in social studies? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's every single discipline known to man, everything but the kitchen sink, maybe even the kitchen sink. So if you have that many disciplines, how can you possibly teach that to kids? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What exactly can kids possibly learn if you're throwing that much at them? Mm-hmm. So social studies is basically about developing skills. Mm-hmm. It has nothing to do with knowledge. Mm-hmm. Okay, so what's the problem there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know if this is exactly your question, but I mean, the thing that stands out to me, I don't want to jump ahead because this might be two steps ahead of where we want to get to with social studies. So, sorry, can you repeat your question?
Yeah, so the problem is this, if you have, so what we're doing then, so if we're thinking about history, so yes. History is important because it gives us a point of reference.
Yeah.
Right? It lets us know, or is this a trend? Is this something we've seen before? Is this something novel? How do we respond to something? Well, if you are looking at the past solely for the service of the present, then you contort the past for the use of the present. Mm-hmm. So in other words, you're not understanding the past in its own terms, and thus what lessons it has to teach you, you can't apply to your particular historical moment.
So it's kind of the tearing down of statues effect, where the purpose is to say, once again, we've progress on the timeline. So we're sitting here. So by the fact that we're sitting here, we're able to look back at the old cultures and then just simply kind of judge those cultures. Yes. And that ends up becoming the practice.
And it's almost the de facto judgment is, well, because we are in the modern era and we're so much better, stronger, faster, and because, Darwin says we're better, stronger, faster, smarter, well, then anything that we do must be superior to anything that we did in the past. So we tend to look at the past through a judgmental lens, and judging the past by our own standards. Mm-hmm.
So not wrestling with the standards they had.
Correct. Mm-hmm. And it's not
on an equal playing field at the very least.
Yes. And it's not looking at them as humans wrestling with life's challenges the same way that we should be, right? We're all struggling with challenges in life. Mm-hmm. And so we can learn from the past because they're humans just like us. Mm-hmm. And they've encountered some of the same situations that we see either on an individual or a collective level. Mm-hmm. And so there are things to learn from the past. Some of them could be, what they didn't work. Let's try something else. But it could be, they really wrestled with this problem. And it encourages me to know that I'm not the only one.
Mm-hmm. That was Jacob Benson, by the way, just breaking into her recording studio. I look over like, well, who would be breaking in? And it turns out to be someone we know. Can't bring that guy anywhere. Goodness gracious. Oh, man. So what? Okay. So I just lost my train of thought. So I'm back. So yes, we've got the social studies. Is there anything else you want to say about?
So again, it's one of those things where, see, I'm trying not to be judgmental of the past either.
Mm-hmm.
There is a really good reason.
Yes, in the way that not just judging John Dewey. But
there is a really good reason for the development of social studies. Think about this: early 20th century United States. What's just happened?
We've
had a civil war, which emancipated an entire population of people who had no idea how to be a citizen.
Mm-hmm.
Formal, informal education. They had no idea how to be a citizen. They'd been slaves. We have millions of people coming to the United States as immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
And now they're coming from not just Northern Europe, but they're coming from Central, Southern Europe. And they're very different from the people who were already here. And then, in the early 20th century, women get the right to vote.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They also haven't received citizenship training. So there's a real concern that we have a whole mass of people out here who are going to be voting and who are going to be engaged in the political process, who are going to be leaders of their communities. And we're not sure they know how to do this.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really the origin of social studies. But I think it's because it was influenced by ideas coming out of the Enlightenment, Charles Darwin, John Dewey. The solution to a very real problem maybe was not the most effective long-term strategy. And so when we forget, for example, social studies, there is a particular reason at a particular moment that we developed this program of study. Is that what we still need? Is there something else that would be of greater benefit to our students at this particular historical moment than this?
Yeah. So when you go from John Dewey to today, are we very similar to what he put forth, or have we changed even drastically from there?
Well, if you talk to psychologists, they're not behavioralists anymore. Psychology has gone in a completely different direction. We don't, thankfully, do eugenics anymore. So we're not at the same particular moment. But again, that's one of those things. If we lose sight of where these ideas came from, when they crop up in our modern curriculum, we don't recognize them.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So again, they're pernicious because they're sort of embedded in some of the ways in which we do things or think about things, and we're not aware of it.
Yeah. And that seems like, one of the things that's really important, right? So we've talked about this before, but like if you go on McGraw-Hill and you go to their About Me page, right? One of the major curriculum publishers in America, they'll say things like equity of education, and you say, well, what is that? And that's getting back to some of the notions that you've talked about, but it is this notion that what we've inherited is they would say, a biased type way of thinking, which, to really use your language, it's going back even to that, like the French Enlightenment idea that what's happened, well, the church crept into the West and the church controlled the narrative and the church brainwashed to some degree. And we've been inheritors of that. So what do we need to have enlightened and free-thinking people? Well, we need to recognize that built-in bias that has come through those corrupt institutions. And what is the way that you retaliate against that? Well, you have to kind of start to silence that voice, and you actually need to even overcompensate in the other way, in other views and other philosophies of thinking. And for them, of course, these are people that are educated and, PhDs. So who are they studying that pushed that? And these are many of the people that you've mentioned and others, even get to some of the 20th century, 20th century French thinkers, they kind of added to this as well. So that's what they're drawing from. And once again, you can't see through all things, right? So there is something that they are pushing, and that is the notion that they are pushing, and then they are building that into the way that they form their curriculum.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that's the value of classical education, right? Because if we think about, and I think you're absolutely right when you phrase it that way, because I think that a lot of our contemporary thinkers really believe that the church back in the past eras was oppressive, and it prevented people from being what they wanted to be, and so, but what we have to remind young people is the ideas like the cardinal virtues, some of those ideas about seeking truth, the lifelong pursuit of truth, being aware of oneself and one's responsibility to neighbors, to community, are not just Christian ideas. They go back to the Greeks and Romans. They're threaded through the entire Western history. So you can't, so that's the reason why, for example, Christianity adopted some of these ideas of the Greeks and Romans, because there's an affinity there, because it has to do with humanity. And there is a sense of, the divine, right? There's some sort of divine entity. Plato talked about the one, right? So what classical education then can do is remind us of this broad Western tradition that comes from, when we talk about it in class, we kind of think about it like the Mississippi River. So like the Mississippi River, when it starts in Bemidji, Minnesota, you can like put a foot on either side of it, right? Mm-hmm. But if you're down in New Orleans, it's a completely different river, right? Yes. It's still the same river, but it looks completely different by the time you get down there. So that's the Western tradition, right? It's not static, but there are certain things in it that, like, for example, there's always water in the Mississippi River. Mm-hmm. So the contours of the river are different, but there's always water. Mm-hmm. So that's how we should look at Western tradition, right? That there's the water that remains constant, but the contours of the river change over time.
Like as it enters into Christendom and such.
Exactly.
Yeah. And even into different contexts and different ages.
And so I think that classical education is designed not only to, develop the individual student with a care for the whole person, right? Not just the academic ability, but also nourishing the soul and preparing for life. But it can also remind us again of some of these things that span the eras of Western tradition. So they're common to humanity.
Mm-hmm. So we're here at the CCLE conference. So I just, I've heard this from McPherson and others, and I'm a convert to the idea of classical education. So when I was at seminary, I had some friends that advocated for it. I remember I had a professor's wife that cornered me once and talked to me for about an hour, and I was kind of like, good for you approach. I was like, it was a nice conversation, right? Yeah. But she was passionate about it. I'm like, good, you're passionate about it. That seems like a cool thing. I don't know if I'm terribly interested. And then I was converted through kind of three avenues. So one was we were close to Patrick Henry. No, it's not Patrick Henry. It was It was the college that Anthony Esselin used to be at. It's in I'm drawing a blank on the name, but it's in just north of Nashua, New Hampshire, in Merrimack. And so they had a classical college there, and I interacted with some of the kids there because I sat on a couple different things to where they had some representatives, and I was just blown away by how articulate and how bright the kids were. So there was this anecdotal difference where I said, okay, there's something different about these kids, and the college is telling me it's because they're doing a classical type approach to education. So that was one. Second, The Abolition of Man.
Oh, yeah.
Which I had read probably 3 times before, and then I finally read it with wrestling with classical education. I go, oh, this is what he's talking about. This is exactly what he's talking about.
This is exactly what he's talking about.
And then third and finally, like the studies that have come out, like the Notre Dame study or the classical difference study, which are just monumental. So those kind of things converted me. And then I started to look underneath the lid. And then the more I've learned about it, I've said, that makes complete sense, right? It just lines up. So I'm a convert to it, but I'm interested to hear what would be kind of your case for classical education for, like, let's say my daughter Eiley. Like, what would happen to my daughter Eiley or my son Lincoln if they go through that process? Well,
I think that classical education, again, it's about it really does focus on language. Mm-hmm. And language is, and Melanchthon said this, that language, the mastery of language means that you can read, you can think, you can speak, you can listen. It really is. Without it, you're truncated, and then it's the door to everything else. And basically, it equips you for lifelong learning. So, classical education, I think, develops the student's abilities fully.
Kind of like the soft skills.
Yeah. Well, and just things sort of intangible like discipline. Thinking, not thinking maybe about something in particular, but just thinking. Because as I tell my students, I'm
thinking clearly.
Yeah, and just spending time with yourself in a healthy way, right? As I ask my students this because they've never thought about it because, there's no cure for 18. Who are you going to be spending the next 50, 60 years with 24/7, 365 days a year? It's you.
Mm-hmm.
What you got in there? Right? Because we know that isolation is not good.
Mm-hmm.
We also know recent research has shown that too much like social media, too much time on social media is also not good. Mm-hmm. So we have to find that balance. So I think classical education is about developing that life of the mind, right? Not necessarily for a particular application.
Not just so you can be a philosopher,
but developing the person, right? I think it teaches you how to learn, how to think. And I think it connects you, again, with that broader Western tradition. I think you develop a better sense of yourself as part of humanity. And, you are the heir of all the generations before you, and you have a responsibility to all the generations after you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something also we don't emphasize because of the focus on the individual. So I think that classical education is about developing the individual, but not the individual in isolation, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think students are introduced to the best things.
Mm-hmm.
And that can't only help but promote development of the individual.
Yeah. Yeah. It's that's why they call it the liberal arts, right? You become a free individual. And I always love Dorothy Sayers' little saying where it's like a little test where like, what's the purpose of education? And it's so that you can't be deceived by marketing.
Correct.
Because if you're deceived by marketing, that means you're not a free thinker. You're enslaved to kind of your emotional whims and other people can manipulate you. But if you're a free thinker, you can examine the data of what's being presented to you. You can logically process it and then rhetorically come to a conclusion of, no, I don't actually need that, for instance.
Yeah, it's all about discernment. But you can't learn discernment a lot of discernment comes through experience. But a lot of it is knowing what's good and bad, knowing what's right and wrong. And the only way you can learn that is by reading the best things, where that's what they talk about. That's what they wrestle with.
Yeah, and there's some of those, some of the great books that I've read. Brothers Karamazov is an example to where that is a bore. And there's beautiful places where you just don't want to put it down, and there's other ones where you're like, I don't want to pick this book back up, right? It's really rough. But one of the values of those books, right, is that there's certain scenes that stick with you.
Yep.
And you don't necessarily even recognize it when you're reading it, but it keeps coming back to you because the way they like position a scene and then they get a dialogue going and they present a point, and especially with the way they'll do dialogue, they'll present kind of both aspects and allow that conversation to kind of flow out. And what they're doing is they're exposing three-dimensionally an idea, and that becomes kind of implanted in you. And to your point, then when you allow your mind just to have a moment of freedom, and you're thinking about something, that picture or that narrative point comes back, and all of a sudden, like, it makes sense in a new way. And that happens dozens of times with a single. And that's the beauty of some of these books. But those books are written by people that are classically trained, in the words that we're using. And so therefore they are used to thinking and to analyzing and to diving into nuance and all of these types of things.
I think it's, it's about living well. And, Christian classical education has the added enrichment of Scripture.
Yeah.
Right. That's what anchors us in the good, the true, and the beautiful. But there are other things, in addition to that, in that Western tradition that students are also exposed to.
Yeah, and one of the things that it does for Scripture, it's, for instance, one of the when I read like a modern popular Christian book, not always, but for the most part, I could sense this before I understood it. You'd read that, and my favorites are kind of the Inklings, right? So Tolkien, Lewis, Chesterton, George MacDonald. You could go back to like something like Augustine. They're not in the same. No. They're not in the same state. Like it's completely different.
Yep.
And one is sometimes. There's a ton of books that get published, right? But they seem to have an emotional bend. Today. Yeah. And they seem to be one or two layers deep. And they're just kind of, it's almost as if you're reading the Bible like a text, like a modern day textbook. Like, well, what does this mean? Oh, Jesus means this.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Boom. Categorize that. Let's move on to the next section.
Yeah.
So whereas it seems like these classical thinkers, or especially like the church fathers, they can take like a theme or a passage in the Bible, or particularly like a story in the Bible, and they can see it having 20, 30, 40 different connections in other places, and they see this playing out, and then they can see these contemplative ideas that flow out of these themes. Yep. And it's amazing, and it's deep, and it's holistic in the way that it's applied to so many elements of life and of thought. But you to get there, you have to train your mind to be able to read and to think in this way. Right.
And it's one of my students has stumbled upon this, the idea of meditation. Mm-hmm. Not like, but like really, and this is, I think, what Luther meant when he said, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest. Mm-hmm. He really means to meditate on something and basically sort of walk around it, look at it from multiple perspectives, think about it. Mm-hmm. What does this mean? What does this mean for me? What is the Lord telling me here? Right. And that takes patience. Mm-hmm. It takes practice. And you have to, you have to be, you have to be open to listening, right, and wrestling with something.
Yeah, and just to maybe give a concrete example, a very popular parable would be like let's take the parable of the sower, mm-hmm. right? So the parable of the sower, so you've got, and Jesus does explain this, right? So there's kind of this first level reading, right, which is great and true. It's not to take away from the first level reading of like, God plants his word, he puts it in different places, the soil, reacts in different ways, and either the gospel message is kind of choked out, or, mm-hmm. it expounds 30, 60, 100-fold, when that takes place. But I was listening to someone who I think is a good, he's a good modern example of someone who thinks kind of holistically in this way, or typologically in this way, or kind of really meditates on kind of the I don't know the right word, it's not syllogism, but like, just all the depth that comes out of it, and he was saying that, there's this, what is a seed? A seed is something that is completely tiny, right? And you almost can't see it. But then once it's planted, then it takes root and it starts to expand and to grow into all things. And that's what an idea does. Mm. And Christopher Nolan does this in his movie Inception, mm-hmm. where the whole point of that movie isn't really about, he is interested in like the nature of dreams, but what he's really interested in is what happens when an idea is planted in your mind. And mm-hmm. it's just very true that when an idea is planted, especially at its deepest forms, especially if it's early on in your childhood or something mm-hmm. like that will in fact take root, and it will shape the way that you think throughout mm-hmm. life, mm-hmm. right? So what's the parable doing? The parable is telling you about what God does, about, spreading his word and whatnot, and how it connects with you. But there is this notion of like, that's what happened in the West.
Yep.
Right? Is that little seed came down, this idea of the gospel message, right? Which was something so small at first you almost couldn't see it. And it was planted in the West. And what happened was, over time, like it transformed the things we're talking about, right? It transformed the way that the Greeks, did education. Yep. And it took that, there was a fertile ground there. Mm-hmm. And then it mm-hmm. grew, and it expanded 30, 60, 100-fold. And that idea, like it grows into everything. It expands, and there's no limit to the degree which it can expand, right?
Right.
But hearing him talk about that, it's like, that's not okay, so God wants his word to go out. Check. Go tell other people about Jesus, right? Yes, do those things that aren't taken away from that truth, but there's layers of depth here on the way to understand like an idea, a concept, the way your mind works, the way that transforms society, all these kinds of things.
Yeah, and even just in that parable, just the notion of patience,
mm-hmm.
right? Because the seed grows very slowly.
Mm-hmm.
I know we just had this thing, we planted a tree, like a little stick, last year, and we thought it was dead because there's no leaves on it. So my husband pulled it up. 2 days later, there's like this little thing growing up with like tons of leaves on it,
mm-hmm.
right? So that's thinking about an idea and understanding that sometimes it doesn't show up right away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we could probably go back and forth for the next 30 minutes and pull out different elements.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you can attach it to stories in the Old Testament where this takes place.
Yep.
It's just you can, this meditative understanding, but then you have to be able to understand the way that like parable interacts with like an Old Testament story, or with elements of like the law or the prophet. Like it becomes a giant tree. God's word becomes a giant tree that's all intertwined and whatnot, but it takes time. And it takes a proper, mental process of being able to examine these things.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's, for example, what in the Reformation, that's what they were trying to accomplish through education.
So there's a lot of noise out there. I think there's a Gemütlichkeit here at CCLE, which we should probably go attend
We should probably
here.
go.
Yeah. But any kind of closing, anything else that you want us to know?
No, I just appreciate having the chance to talk about some of the stuff that I'm passionate about.
Yeah.
And
This was a lot of fun, and I look forward to when's your presentation? Is it tomorrow?
it's Wednesday morning.
Wednesday morning.
Yeah,
okay.
Wednesday morning.
I very much look forward to it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Susan Mobley, thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.